Hi, I'm Madison Freeman. I'm a senior advisor to Secretary John Kerry, the Special Presidential Envoy for Climate, focused on innovation and new technologies. I'm here in the DOE headquarters with Jigar Shah, Director of the Loans Program Office. Jigar, we're here at the virtual Electrify stage to talk about private sector action through procurement. So can you share a little bit more about why procurement of decarbonized materials matters to the development of the supply of those commodities?
Yeah, of course. And really love the leadership that Secretary Kerry is doing on First Movers Coalition and some of these other pieces. I think when you look at commercialization, right, DOE has been an extraordinary organization around innovation. But then when it gets to that sort of, we've proven the technologies, now what? Right, we need early leaders to do procurement, to buy green cement, to buy green steel, to procure direct air capture, carbon removal credits, like all the things that we're hearing about today. But then the question becomes, when you have $62 billion of new money that goes into the Department of Energy, what role does each group play? Like, what is the commercialization of a first-of-a-kind plant look like? What does that do from an engineering excellence standpoint? Where does the earth shots fit in, right? The learning curve, and are reducing the costs of the technology. In the case of carbon removal, I think we're trying to get to $100 a ton by 2030, and then to be able to do 6 gigatons a year, which is what the globe needs, right, of carbon removal, for instance. You're talking about $600 billion a year at $100 a ton. Where does $600 billion come from, right? And so part of the challenge, I think, that the procurement has is that we're hearing a lot of big procurement announcements, but we're not figuring out, like, well, what's the 10-year strategy? Where does this go? Right?
Yeah.
Like, what does it feed into? What are the expectations of each of the players? And so I think that's the next stage of conversation.
Mm-hmm. And in terms of that procurement, when you're thinking through how this demand can then foster a really strong and vibrant supply ecosystem in all of these critical areas, how do you see that filtering in, especially in the next few years? We're seeing procurement commitments, like with the First Movers Coalition, which you mentioned that my office has been running with the World Economic Forum. We now have, almost 60 companies that are making procurement commitments by 2030 for highly decarbonized materials. But when we look at, deploying capital, especially through LPO, through, other organizations, through the private sector, for these first-of-a-kind facilities, that needs to start being done in the next few years to make that supply happen by 2030. So do you have any thoughts on the ways in which procurement can be, we can go beyond just one broader procurement announcement and really drill down into something that's specific that can be, that can foster and drive the financing needed for those facilities?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think that we have to keep in mind what the goal is, right? And so when you think about where we're headed, we want to assemble something on the order of $100 billion of capital per sector, right? Because that's what it takes to get from where we are today, which is technology that works, to the mass market, right? So you can get $1 trillion of capital that, like, we all know that we need to be able to reach the 2035 decarbonization goals for electricity and the 2050 goals for the entire economy, right? And so the question is, what are we trying to accomplish with that procurement, right? And largely, I'd say that we're trying to accomplish a first-of-a-kind plant deployment, because just because the technology works doesn't mean you can run the plant, right? Does the plant run 50% of the time? Does it run 90% of the time? Are there maintenance issues? Do we have enough workers that are trained to run the plant, right? And so when you think about our nuclear fleet, for instance, it took us from 1979 to almost 1984 to get from a 70% uptime to 92% uptime, which we have today, right? So that's how long it took to train the workers and the operators to run it more efficiently, right? And so my sense is what we're trying to accomplish is to get the plants running so that people believe that it's possible and that we know how to do it. And then what we're trying to do is inspire, in the United States at least, state-level legislators to say, well, we need to now mandate green cement in California or New Jersey or New York or whatever, right? And so then that initial procurement contract proved the first-of-a-kind plant, and then that inspires state legislators to then, put in compliance mandates, and then that allows the next 10 plants to get built. And then we just, create this flywheel of support to scale. right? And, the LPO needs to reach a reasonable prospect of repayment. So we can reach that in the first plant just through the procurement contracts. But we want to know that it's not, a cul-de-sac where we do one project and then we're all done. We want to know that it leads to 10 more projects, right? And so I think building out what we're trying to catalyze is the confusing part.
Yeah. And you mentioned, the procurement by state level government, for example, or city government, and it's especially a very appealing customer for many of these production facilities in cement or in steel to look at the transportation agencies. But we're trying to mobilize some of that through these buying green initiatives cross government. Do you see any particular state or even other country that's sort of been taking initiative and really leading at the forefront of that procurement? And how do you see that interplaying with some of these corporate procurement initiatives as well?
Yeah, I think we just need to normalize the conversation around capital formation. Like, we need to raise $100 billion. Like, it doesn't matter what we're trying to solve, whether it's new nuclear, new carbon, direct air capture, green steel, green cement. It's always $100 billion to get across the bridge to bankability to the mass market, right? And so now we figure out what tools we have. So in the federal government, my point is more that we're unlikely in the federal government context to mandate green steel or green cement. What we can do is say, if you want to use the bipartisan infrastructure law money to get money out of the Department of Transportation for your road, we would like for 5% of that cement to be green cement, right? Which is useful, right? But it's not the same thing as mandating green cement for everyone, right? That's something that generally gets done at the state level, right? Like the state of California and others, we did renewable portfolio standards in the past. We've now recently mandated renewable natural gas in some of these places to figure out what to do with manure from the farming industry. And so to me, I think that there are all these procurement activities like federal procurement, but then there's separately a compliance framework, right, which is really what a renewable portfolio standard is. It's not people choosing to sign a corporate PPA. It's going to the electric utility industry and saying, you will meet 20% of all of your electricity by X date from renewables, right? And that allows them to then sign contracts. And so each one of these tools are required to give the level of confidence needed for the people providing the $100 billion to get ready to go, right? Because if they're not signaling that they're ready to go, then developers won't start working on the 4-year arduous task of developing a project, right? Like, why would you develop a project if you're completely uncertain whether someone's going to be over here to invest in the project 4 years later?
Yeah, absolutely. And, having that concrete demand creates enough certainty to then be, approaching financing facilities and really be spurring forward all these developments that we need in order to reach our goals. I just wanted to pick on one thing that you were mentioning there about this potential, about a carve out, for example, for a percentage of procurement to be from decarbonized, low carbon, or near zero carbon sources. So that's something that the First Movers Coalition has been trying to mobilize in the private sector, saying, hey, by 2030, 10% of your steel purchases being near zero carbon, we think that that's very achievable. Even if we're not looking at full decarbonization by that date, that is technology forcing and sort of spurs the development of these new facilities and these new technologies in order to put us on track to being, towards net zero by 2050. Yeah. But one of the things that, the conversations we sort of have over and over again with these different technologies and thinking about, especially these first movers, these first facilities, is that green premium. And, we've often gotten kind of pushback from both companies, and we also hear this in conversation about public procurement about how can we justify the really significant initial premium often for these decarbonized materials, since any type of technology when you're deploying it for the first time is often just more expensive. You get to scale through decades and decades of building cement plants or steel plants a similar way, and it becomes much cheaper to build a new one. So I guess I'm just curious what your thoughts are, and how those sorts of carve-outs also interact with the increasing price or the increased price often for these low-carbon materials. And any thoughts you have towards companies that are maybe resistant to procurement of low-carbon materials because of that price increase?
Yeah, it's a good question. And I think that oftentimes we end up lacking context in how we're thinking about this. So when you think about the large corporations, for instance, who put money into the Frontier effort for buying direct air capture credits, or the First Movers Coalition effort, right? The amount of money that they're spending on this is not 1% or 2%, it's like 0.1%, right? And so the impact on their procurement costs is negligible to zero, right? But even at negligible to zero, it still actually sends enough signal to get to $100 billion, right? And so the question becomes how fast and how much and, and how soon, right? So when you think about what the premium is for green steel, for instance, right? It might be 30% more expensive initially for that first plant, but it's 1% of what they're buying, right? And then that second plant may be 20% premium. And then the third one is a 10% premium. Remember, this is not a green premium. Like, that doesn't exist. It's a technology premium. All things are expensive when you do it first, right? Whether it's an electric car or whether it's a computer, right? So all technologies have a premium associated with it. And as you get to higher and higher levels of procurement, that premium goes practically to zero. And then oftentimes it flips. And then now this technology is cheaper than the high carbon version of that product. And you see that with solar and wind and lithium ion batteries, et cetera. So the context really matters. And there are some people who want to be in this framework, and that's what the First Movers Coalition, I think, represents. And there's others who say, no, we're going to be in the third round, right? We don't want to be in the first two rounds of procurement. We want to be in the third round of procurement when the premium's only a few percentage points, or we're already, getting to a savings, right? But when you think about how this works, it sort of flips on itself. So people who did corporate power purchase agreements, right, with virtual contracts, were contracts for differences, right? So they signed contracts for solar and wind at a fixed price. Let's call it $24 a megawatt hour. And at the time, power was trading at $19 a megawatt hour. So they were paying a premium of $5 a megawatt hour. Today, power is trading at $35 a megawatt hour. Now they're paying $10 cheaper because they're fixed, right? So you can call it a premium, you can call it a discount, but in fact what it is a hedge, right, against volatility in the future. And so what percentage of your procurement do you want that hedge for? Yeah. And, it probably is fine to put a hedge on 5%, 10% of your procurement. So I feel like we get in trouble by calling things green premium when it's not what it is. And we do this all the time. There's always a technology premium. There are people who are technology enthusiasts that want to go first, right? They want to get the more expensive, way to control all your lights from your phone, and they do it first. And then, right after it gets out of the Consumer Electric Show in Las Vegas, they buy one, and then 5 years later, I'm sitting there buying one. Yeah. And so that's normal. And I think it matters the words that we use, because there is no such thing as a green premium. There's a technology premium. There are people who want to go first. And for many of these companies, we're talking about 1 to 3% of their total procurement maximum to move the market to inspire the full $100 billion to get put together for this revolution. Yeah, I think that's a great point. I mean, I do feel like the word choice is important, and talking about the fact that these are new technologies where you're securing your supply chain of the future. In many cases, it's not just a decarbonized way to make steel or cement, but it's often a much better. It's much environmentally cleaner. It lasts longer. It's more durable. It holds up to hot and cold cycles. Yeah, absolutely. So on that vein, are there any technologies in the realm of procurement? You mentioned a number earlier with cement and steel and carbon removal and aluminum and all these other spaces, but are there any that you're particularly hopeful about, or that you're excited about, looking at? Yeah, no, I mean, I think there's a lot of sectors that are at the point of billion-dollar scale. And that's really what we're talking about, right? So when folks are at $10 million scale, you're sort of like, that's great, that's a demonstration project, and we just want to, give them grants, and that's fine. When you decide that you actually want to really scale things up, you've got to be at billion-dollar scale, heading towards $100 billion scale, right? And those technologies are, by definition, it's a, sort of a way, it's something you can actually just look at the data and figure out which ones are there. Sustainable aviation fuel is clearly there, right? The electrification of fleets and passenger vehicles and those kinds of things are there. Electric vehicle charging infrastructure is there, hydrogen is there, right? And so steel, cement, I think that you're also there on the nuclear side. And so there's a lot of these pathways, and you see that within the IEA, frameworks where they're saying, here are the 400 technologies we need to scale up to meet the decarbonization goals. Some percentage of them are ready for this level of intervention to get to the first billion-dollar scale. I'd say like recycling plastics is there, figuring out how we actually do the whole circular economy around renewable natural gas, but also around compost, and some of those things are there. And so there's a lot of areas where we're like, oh, I thought that was already scaled up. You're like, nope, we still need to work on that. And so I do think that corporate procurement is the catalyst that's required at this particular stage, which then allows us to provide first-of-a-kind financing, which then allows you to get state-level mandates put in place, which allows you to get to that $100 billion scale.
Yeah. Well, I think this is a really important case for the need for corporate procurement in these spaces and the need for greater action. I know this conversation is supposed to be closing out a day of this conference, and that there are many corporations who are engaged as participants. So I'm just wondering if you have any final messages or thoughts to share with those folks in the audience, especially when it comes to, the need to scale this sort of procurement.
Yeah, I think that, we're at a very interesting point where the government has passed $1.2 trillion in the bipartisan infrastructure law. I think there's additional support for different programs now. And these corporate procurements matched with the federal procurement changes that we're making need to be catalyzing something. And I think it's important that everyone recognizes what they're catalyzing. Mm-hmm. I think that a lot of times people say, well, I made the commitment, like, I'm good. I did what I did. I've got a press release. I get, like a reward for that. I was like, maybe, but like what we really need is to figure out where this sits. Like, so you did the procurement, great. We have $3.5 billion for the DAC hubs. We have $8 billion for hydrogen hubs. How do you see your procurement fitting in to these government programs? Like, you also have a responsibility to give us your advice and counsel on like where you think all of this goes and where you think capital should go. I think that there is a very engineering-centric point of view a lot of times to scale up and commercialization. And honestly, we're just all humans trying to get along. And so we have to coordinate better with each other. So yeah. I think the procurement is not an endpoint. It's the start of a conversation around how we do industrial policy to actually get to these, trillion-dollar scale outcomes.
Mm-hmm. I love that. Really important to have those conversations mobilize our end goal. But thank you for your time today, Jigar, and I'm going to hand things back to Sarah.